Oh no, 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 no. What have they done? So today we have the announcement of Blizzard that by the next weekly reset we are getting some class tuning, mostly nerfs to the Exodia comp and then a bunch of buffs to a few of the other specs. So let's start quickly with the side dishes of the buffs to the underperforming specs, starting with Unholy Death Knight. They are getting 8% damage to Epidemic and 12% damage to Bursting Source. Now, this is not because of this. Unholy is doing more than fine in the raid and, generally speaking, in single target. These are buffs to their AoE, damage spells and talents. That is because in AoE, Unholy is much lower down the totem pole of power of other specs, even 20 or 30% weaker than other specs. So these buffs to Unholy are because of their weaker AoE damage. Then again, they were already eating good in the raid, so it's not that they were in a terrible situation, not nearly as terrible as Marksmanship, which gets an 8% damage to multi-shot and 10% more damage to explosive shot. This is the same situation. They were trash in AoE, much like Unholy, and doing, overall better when it came to single target damage in the raid. So once more, these are buffs to Marksmanship to help them with their lacking AoE damage. You then have similar treatment to Red Paladin. Divine Storm, Wake of Ashes and Consecration were all buffed. Once more, we look at the single target raid damage of Red Paladin. They are amongst the higher consistent damage dealers in the raid. Once you go in Mythic Plus, they have a lower AoE damage compared to their peers in quite the high tier of value, because they don't have nearly as big of an AoE damage. When you lose in AoE overall damage to a Feral Druid, you are kind of low. That's another buff to another spec, which wasn't really, that weak or that underperforming, but still, that's what Blizzard is going for. We then have two buffs, one to Discipline and one to Holy. Discipline gets 11% more Atonement Healing, from 36% to 40%, and Priest gets a buff to Rhapsody, now stacks every 1 second instead of every 2 seconds, and causes Holy Nova to do more damage per stack. This is a buff to the damage of Holy Priest, mostly because the damage of Holy Priest is basically right now the weakest in the game. So another help, this time to a healer to do more damage. Lastly, talking about side dishes, we have the 5% all ability damage and auto attack damage to Outlaw. Outlaw at the moment is overall towards the low end in Mythic Plus and towards the low end in the raid, in particular in single target, so they are getting help in that regard. And then buffs to Warrior, Ravager and Thunderous Roar damage, these are not nearly as important, and then the buff to improve the Whirlwind for more single target damage to Fury. These, however, are all side dishes, as I mentioned, are very minor buffs, and they won't likely change anything. Perhaps maybe the Unholy buff in AoE damage might have more of a result, but most of the other ones are very, very small. What we're here to talk about today is the disaster of the nerfs to the Exodia comp. We talked about this, we had 1, 2, even 3 videos about what to do or what was gonna happen in this situation. What should Blizzard do to fix this issue? Because if they nerf the specs now, what's gonna happen to everyone who was busy pushing high keys, right? If you nerf them, then they won't be able to go any higher, which means that the season basically ends to everyone who was trying to push. So players were trying to tinker, to think about what was going to be the solution. Should we nerf the Exodia comp, but also nerf all of the dungeons? So now it's easier to do them for everyone after the Exodia comp has been nerfed, or should we nerf them and then buff everyone else? So it's still easier for the other specs to do those dungeons. The answer for Blizzard was nothing. The answer for Blizzard is, we are just going to nerf those specs and that's it. We're not going to touch the dungeons. We're just going to make the dungeons harder to do because we are nerfing the best specs in the game, right? So first in line is Guardian. Guardian gets 8% damage reduction to Thrash and 8% damage reduction to Raze. Guardian was the second strongest damage dealer in Mythic Plus, right behind the massive advantage of Brewmaster Monk, but Brewmaster Monk is made of paper, so the strongest tank in terms of damage basically was Guardian. Not to mention, Guardian was the strongest when it came to huge pools because of the way it scales with numbers. The Guardian is one of the few tanks which can gain more value the more targets you are hitting because of your rage regen, because of your trash, because of your absorb shield generated. All of this worked very well. Not to mention the synergy of Guardian with the Exodia comp. This is something many players have talked about. The Exodia Specs power is greater than the sum of their parts. For example, Guardian gains a lot of value with stamina, with having more health. Why? Because their Ursoc's Fury shield is based on their max HP. So, if you have a priest, that gives you fortitude for more stamina. If you have an evoker, an augmentation evoker that gives you more stamina, you are gaining more value. And why not? Augmentation evoker also gives you max main stat to generate a bigger absorb shield with Ursoc's Fury. All of this compounds into tons and tons of different benefits for the specs. Not to mention Paladin gives you damage reduction. Multiple ways of giving you damage reduction, which means your shield will last for longer because you are taking less damage, etc, etc, etc. So all of this is just to say that these nerfs do absolutely nothing to nerf Guardian Druid any meaningful way. They are still the tankiest tank, they are still the tank with the most damage besides Brewmaster Monk. So this is not gonna change much of anything. What is also not gonna change much of anything is Augmentation Evoker. The first nerf is the Fate Mirror's chance to proc has been reduced to 10% instead of 15%. Now, we can just take a trip to the rankings of Mythic Plus and pick literally just a random evoker you guys choose. Close my eyes, scroll up and down, let's pick here. That's a little bit too low. Let's pick this guy in Vortex Pinnacle. When you click on him, you will find that Fate Mirror's damage, where is it? Oh wow, it's 6.2% of their damage. What a huge nerf this is going to be. You know, what big changes to the spec? Nothing. It will change nothing to the damage of augmentation. What is a little bit bigger though is Breath of Eons accumulates 10% of damage done by allies with your Ebon Might instead of 15%. Now, Breath of Eons is a bit more relevant than the damage of Fate Mirror because of course it's also stronger because of burst damage. You know, this might be much more valuable than 14% because it allows you to generate situations where you can gain massive damage also for the rest of your group. The general reason talking about Exodia being greater than the sum of their parts was because Breath of Eons on a 2-minute cooldown could be lined up with things like Combustion of a Fire Mage, with things like Power Infusion of a Priest, even something like Blessing of Summer of a Holy Paladin, line them together for incredibly high amounts of AoE damage. What you also need to be able to do incredibly high amounts of AoE damage is a very large number of enemies. Which is the tank that is the best at pulling the largest number of enemies? It's a druid in Incarnation. Let's go back to our friend Evoker over here. Let's just switch it over to Guardian. Let's move over to casts. Let's remove this. Let's click on Incarnation. What's the cooldown of Incarnation? Anyone knows? Oh, look! Hey, look! It's every couple of minutes! What a coincidence! Now we can use Blessing of Summer, Power Infusion, Combustion, Incarnation, and Breath of Eons, mix them all together, and what that allows us to do is to pull 4 packs of mobs and just do like a 2 million DPS on your Fire Mage. That's the result of what Breath of Eons allows you to do. This will make it somewhat weaker. In fact, it's basically 40% or something weaker than before, which is warranted because the cooldown itself was super powerful. Will this make Augmentation Evoker weaker and / not wanted in Mythic Plus? No. They're still a major mainstay pick of the Exodia comp. This is not going to make them move away by any means. Then we have Fire, and technically also Frost. Nobody cares about Frost because of how OP Fire is, but just so you know, Frost is also busted as well. Frost gets some AoE nerfs to Comet Storm, Blizzard, and Frozen Orb, while Fire gets basically every one of their AoE abilities nerfed by a flat 10%, like across the board. Flame Strike, Flame Patch, Conflagration, Meteor, Phoenix Flames, Living Bomb, just all of them. Now, we all know the power of Fire Mage in AoE is basically still broken OP. They are still between 10 to 30% stronger than any other spec in Mythic Plus when it comes to AoE damage. Yes, it's made stronger because of the synergy we just mentioned, because of the 2-minute cycles around their combustion, which makes them just look even stronger. Likely, if you had the same comp in Mythic Plus that did that thing, that whole strategy around Demolock, this number of Demolock would probably look like 165k and will also look busted. So the comp itself, the Exodia comp itself, does make this number look stronger or become stronger because of buffs, but still, Fire was definitely overperforming in AoE, much more so than they were overperforming in single target. Their single target damage is nothing great compared to many other specs that can match their single target damage, not to mention handily beat them in their same spec. So the AoE damage was the bigger problem for Fire, which is what gets nerfed. Now, the question here with Fire is, would they be substituted? Would this be enough to make them basically go into the bench? We might have that answer once we move over to Paladin, because Holy Paladin gets the largest of the nerfs overall compared to the other Exodia specs. They get nerfs to both of their damage and their healing. They have healing reduced by 5%. On top of that, Light's Protection now gives you less of a damage reduction to the targets with Glimmer by quite a lot, actually 6% less damage reduction. Overflowing Light creates a weaker Absorb Shield based on your Glimmer of Light's overhealing. Tear's Deliverance has lower bonus healing to your spells when you use it. Blessing of Summer, more importantly for damage, now causes attacks to deal 20% additional damage instead of 30%. Fading Light now has a significantly lower amount of self-sustain because now it absorbs 3% of the healing or damage done from holy power generators instead of 10, so it's a massive change. Righteous Judgment has a lower chance to spawn a freebie Consecration, and on top of that, Consecration has been made weaker by 25%. So Holy Paladin is nerfed across the board, starting from their damage. Damage of Holy Paladin in the raid was already the strongest besides Discipline, which is, having to do damage for their rotation, but more importantly in Mythic Plus. They had handily the easiest and largest amount of damage in a key, not to mention what is also more important, their burst damage. We have talked about this already, their burst damage inside of Breath of Eons was even stronger, thanks to things like Blessing of Summer, for example. The healing was not, I would say, not nearly as strong. Likely, with these nerfs to Holy Paladin, these nerfs to healing, their ranking will likely fall below Holy Priest and Resto Druid, and likely even out the one of Preservation Evoker. So, in the raid, their Exodia status will be removed. They will not really be nearly as dominant. In Mythic Plus, it will continue to be there. Yes, they do less damage, still more damage than other healers. They still kept all of their utility and all of their features that made them very powerful. Last of the nerfs is the one to Shadow Priest. It's the smallest one, but also the saddest one, because they get nerfed to Vampiric Touch, Shadow War Pain, and Shadowy Apparition. This is overall something like a 6% nerf to Shadow Priest, 7% even in big AoE pulls. But the problem is, this is not why Shadow was strong. Yes, to be fair, Shadow still had respectable AoE damage. People just started to act as if Shadow Priest is brought in keys just because of the utility and actually their AoE is shit. No, their AoE is still very strong. But, of course, they are still super valuable in Mythic Plus, and the reason why they got their stamp, their certified category of Exodia Spec, was because of their utility. Not just Vampiric Embrace, not just Power Infusion, not just Fortitude, but Master Spell and Mind Soothe. Master Spell is essentially necessary in 2 dungeons and very useful in 4 dungeons out of 8, which makes you near mandatory in any competitive group that wants to push all of the keys. And then Mind Soothe. Mind Soothe is broken. Mind Soothe is basically a shroud on a 10-second cooldown. It's basically making enemies blind for some reason. The amount of range you can just go by thanks to Mind Soothe is ridiculous. What's even worse is that Blizzard seemed to not want rogues to abuse Shroud in Dragonflight, so they gave a lot of enemies stealth sight, so you cannot skip them with Shroud, but then they introduced Mind Soothe in the game. So now you can just skip them with Mind Soothe instead. It allows you to save a ton of time, it allows you to hand pick and cherry pick all of the best possible packs you want, because you can just choose to pick them thanks to Mindsuit, and to just zigzag and dodge whichever packs of mobs you don't want with Mindsuit. So these things together made Shadow Priest super valuable in Mythic Plus. Now, what these changes are going to do to the Exodia comp are, two ways. Way number one is absolutely nothing. Way number one is the season is over. Pushing high keys is over, because these specs will be nerfed too much so that you won't be able to push any higher, and nothing will be done for the rest of the player base for all of the other weaker specs, which will still be declined in 24 or 25 or 26 keys even after these Exodia specs get nerfed. And then you have way number two. Way number two is the distant possibility that after the several nerfs to Holy Paladin and to Shadow Priest, because you still need a priest in your group, because of what we just mentioned, you might have Discipline being moved in place of Holy Paladin, which then in turn frees up a spot for your Shadow Priest. And at that point, some more room for a few other DPS specs might be making in. Perhaps something like Enhancement Shaman, something like Subtlety Rogue, something like Destruction Warlock. Those specs, or even to replace Holy Paladin, Red Paladin might be making their way instead of Shadow Priest. And still, even if that were to happen, every other spec would not make it in, and also the season would still be over, because even with this change of comp, the overall Exodia would still be weaker than this pre-nerf version. So all of the groups that were pushing plus 28s or 29s or 30s after this set of nerfs simply won't be able to anymore. Or the groups that were trying to catch up to them, the groups that were struggling in 27s and 28s, after these nerfs come in, they won't be able to catch up to the ones that abused this comp in the first 1 to 3 weeks of this patch. So either way, regardless of the route we take, route 1 or route 2, the situation has been made essentially still just as bad as before by Blizzard. We have gotten pretty much no buffs of relevance to all of the weaker specs, and even though we are getting Exodia nerfs, which is something players wanted, we wanted them followed by something else, likely by dungeon nerfs. Nerf the Exodia specs, but at the same time nerf the dungeons, because otherwise nobody will be able to do those dungeons anymore, because those were only doable at that level because of how OP that comp was. So Blizzard apparently is not doing this, it's only just laying out a bunch of nerfs to the more popular specs without addressing any of the other problems. That is why I would consider this set of nerfs and changes overall quite a bad one, because it's likely going to continue to keep these specs and this comp very oppressive. As we have seen before, the popularity of these specs in the top runs over the weeks of Dragonflight, they speak for themselves, and I think this will continue all the way up before Season 3, hoping that Blizzard finds some kind of solutions on what to do with Augmentation Evoker, because it seems like it's going to be a problem before next season. But for now, these are the changes planned and coming live in about 3 days in the next reset. So we're stopping here for today on this Saturday. We are thanking, as usual, all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel. You can still support in plenty of other free ways, of course. You can like and comment down below to help with the YouTube algorithm, and then you can also subscribe to the channel itself. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I knew this was gonna happen, and I still just huffed my tank of copium. That's what I get.